The Russian invasion of Ukraine has led to a radical departure in German foreign and security policy. Chancellor Scholz has pledged to increase defense spending, and he's also ditched a gas pipeline project with Russia, a project that former Chancellor Merkel refused to touch. Now, these changes have been welcomed by Washington, where just several weeks ago, lawmakers were openly questioning Germany as a reliable partner. Today, Germany's new defense minister, Christine Lambrecht, visited the Pentagon in Washington. Here's U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin speaking earlier today.
Now, Germany has shown tremendous leadership at this crucial moment. Your Chancellor's decisions to bolster Germany's armed forces are bold and historic. And we look forward to working with you to implement these important changes. We also salute Germany's decision to send security assistance to Ukraine. Your example helped to inspire other allies and partners to follow.
Well, my next guest tonight is Matthew Karnichnig. He is the chief Europe correspondent for Politico here in Berlin. Matthew, it's good to have you on the program. You wrote, I dare say, a blistering piece about German politicians in Russia this week with the headline, Putin's Useful German Idiots. And you write, it shouldn't surprise anyone that Berlin spent the past 16 years with its feet firmly planted on the wrong side of the divide over how to handle Russia. Explain to our viewers what you mean there.
Well, I mean that it's been clear to many people in Europe and in the United States for quite a long time that Putin shouldn't be trusted. But Germany ignored all of these warnings consistently and decided instead to do what German industry wanted and what made sense for them from a energy point of view in terms of getting cheap gas from Russia to heat German households and, more importantly, even for German industry, and it ignored all of these warnings. And it worked well in the short term, but it was a very sort of myopic view, I think, in terms of what Russia was really up to.
You go down the list of political parties and politicians in your article. You also call out Angela Merkel for being the leader of this disastrous policy. I mean, she was often called the Putin whisperer. She was considered by some, even former U.S. President Barack Obama, to be like an oracle with a window into the Kremlin. But you say that she has earned a place in the pantheon of political naivete alongside Neville Chamberlain. Was Angela Merkel, the Putin whisperer, really the Putin appeaser?
She was definitely the Putin appeaser. She might have been whispering to him, but he certainly wasn't listening. And I think a lot of us looked at her record even before this on foreign policy and said that, you know, it's not everything that a lot of people in Western capitals think it was, not just in terms of Russia, but in terms of her policies towards Europe, the Greek crisis, and other issues. So, you know, I think it's sort of interesting that you're seeing the Merkel legacy crumble so quickly. But there can be no doubt that this was a historic error that she made. And it goes back to the decision in 2008 in Bucharest at the NATO summit when Germany resisted including Ukraine and Georgia in NATO. And at the time, the United States under George W. Bush was pushing her in the other direction. She stood her ground and eventually got the French to go along with her. And this was the beginning of a process that has continued up until a couple of weeks ago of basically forgiving the Russians for every misdeed, looking the other way, and continuing to pursue these gas deals. And the problem, I think, in a lot of people's perception is because of the role Gerhard Schröder, her predecessor as chancellor, played in all of this. There's been a lot of focus on his role, and he, of course, joined as chairman of Nord Stream 2, the pipeline project that has been so controversial between Russia and Germany. But really, the power rested with Merkel and the people around her, including Frank-Walter Steinmeier, who at the time was foreign minister from her coalition partner, the Social Democrats, and is now, of course, German president.
You highlight in your article what is an almost self-righteous, holier-than-thou attitude by the political elite here in Berlin when you describe what the German parliament did the day that Ukrainian President Zelensky spoke. I mean, he delivered a scathing indictment of German complicity in the creation of the Putin war machine. What happened directly after that speech in the Bundestag?
Well, directly afterwards, the MPs got up and gave him a standing ovation, which was somewhat bizarre given how critical he had been of them. And then they just moved on to business as usual and congratulated a couple of MPs on their birthdays that day, and just went on to other matters and didn't really have anything like a real discussion about what they just heard from Zelensky. And some of the people in the room in the opposition said this was sort of the most embarrassing day for the Bundestag in living memory.
You know, Matthew, before we run out of time, I read your article and I kept thinking this is exactly what we have reported time and time again for the past 5 years or so, especially over Nord Stream 2. And yet many times it has felt like that there was no resonance or not even an echo in the German media. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think there's been a tendency in Germany for decades, really, in their relationships with the rest of the world, and in particular with the relationship with Russia, to wrap everything in this sort of moral packaging and say that, Germany has this historic debt towards Russia, and this is why we need to pursue dialogue, as they call it, with Russia, no matter what happens. In reality, something else is going on here. This was a purely mercantilistic policy that benefited the German economy, that benefited big German industry, and trying to sell it off as this very moralistic position, I think, has put Germany now in a extremely tough spot, because they would like to just sort of say, well, we're going to kind of move on from this. We were wrong. Schwamm drüber, as they say in German. They're just going to wipe the slate clean and forget that this happened. And I don't think that their allies in Europe or across the Atlantic are going to be willing to let them do that.
Yeah, they're going to need a really big Schwamm, that's for sure. Matthew Karnichnik, Chief Europe Correspondent for Politico here in Berlin. Matthew, we appreciate your time tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.
Lambrecht stressed that in light of Russia's aggression, Germany and its allies stand closer together than ever before.
Putin did not manage to divide NATO or the EU. We stand together and we are reliable partners. Our allies on NATO's eastern flank in particular can rely on this, without question. We support Ukraine with arms deliveries in their incredible fight against a brutal aggressor. And we in Germany will invest in our security and NATO security. The Bundeswehr will receive an additional 100 billion euros for this. This is an important contribution, and it was good to hear that it is greatly appreciated here in Washington.
And for more now, I want to bring in Thomas Silberhorn. He's a member of the German parliament for the conservative CSU party. He's also the go-to person for transatlantic relations. Mr. Silberhorn, we appreciate you taking the time to talk with us tonight. Before the invasion, many in Washington had doubts about Germany being a reliable partner when it comes to Russia. What do you say to them now, 5 weeks into this war?
Germany has always been a reliable partner in our NATO alliance. New is the message that also the new government completely sticks to the 2% goal of NATO. This has not been the case before. It has not been explicitly laid down in the coalition treaty. On the contrary, the Green Party explicitly denied to support the 2% goal. This indeed has changed, and this is a very good message for the German army and for the NATO alliance.
Mr. Silberhorn, there are critics who say that Germany has been on the wrong side of history for decades with its Russia policy, and that it took a war to make German politicians see the light. What do you say?
The lesson we all have to learn, in particular in Europe and in Germany, is there is no appeasement that can be successful. We have to clearly distinct between liberal democracies in the West and autocratic systems like Russia and China. There is a systemic gap that cannot be overruled by which treaty ever. Yes, we need coordination and cooperation where this is possible with Russia or with China, but there is and there will always be confrontation in the substantial issue of the systemic rivalry between democracies and autocratic leadership.
Yeah, you mentioned appeasement. Many in Washington say it was a catastrophic mistake for Germany to allow the Nord Stream 2 pipeline to be constructed. You know, former Chancellor Angela Merkel, she refused to say no to the pipeline. Was it a mistake that you're now having to correct?
Well, it has now been corrected. And yes, indeed, Germany is to a large extent dependent from gas and oil supply from Russia. Similar volumes are delivered to the United States, as you know. So there is a variety of arguments on the table. But now things have been clarified after this brutal attack of Russia against Ukraine. We have to be aware of the substantial preconditions of our bilateral relations. And yes, we have to stand at the right side, and this is at the side of Western democracies. This is clearer than ever.
I know that there are a lot of people in Washington, particularly at the Pentagon, who are glad to hear that Germany is increasing its defense spending. At the same time, the head of NATO's Supreme Command for Europe told U.S. senators this week that he expects there to be a permanent increase in the number of U.S. troops needed to defend Europe against Russia. What role is Germany going to play here? Is Germany going to be able to punch at its weight or even above militarily in the future?
An additional 100 billion euros is a huge step forward for the German army for this current legislative period. But it should not lead to the misunderstanding that you get a combat-ready army by 100 billion euros only. This is, again, a huge step for the next few years, but much, much more is needed for the current period of NATO and EU planning until 2031. So yes, it's a good message, but armament will never be done. It's a permanent task we have to fulfill, and that's why the NATO goal of 2% of our GDP for defense is so crucial and is much more important than this volume of 100 billion additional billion for the next 2 years.
Mr. Thomas Silberhorn, we appreciate you taking the time to talk with us tonight. Valuable insight into transatlantic relations at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you.